Fantastic. That's 401, Lucy. So do you want to switch us to speaker view? Fantastic. So welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Susan Murray and I'm director of the David Hume Institute. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for what I'm sure will be a thought-provoking conversation. Before we get started, I'll tell you a few things about how the event will work. We are recording the session and it will be uploaded to the website afterwards. There'll be approximately 25 to 30 minutes of discussion with Linda and Rachel and I, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. For the Q&A, if you could type your question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and then Lucy will contact you and let you know when to be ready to unmute, and we'll be able to ask your question directly to Linda and Rachel. If we end up tight for time at the end, what we'll do is I'll condense the questions so that we can get through as many as possible. At the end of the event, we'll have some closing thoughts from Ken Barker, the incoming chair of the David Hume Institute. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Linda Scott. Linda is the Emeritus World Chair of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the Said Business School, the University of Oxford, and a visiting professor at Brown University. She has had a long and varied career working with multinational corporations, international agencies, national governments, global NGOs to design and implement and test programs to better include women in the world economy. She has been a senior consulting fellow to Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and is a founder of the Global Business Coalition for Women's Economic Empowerment. And she's also currently working with the World Bank. And if she isn't busy enough, she has now written this book, which has been shortlisted for many awards and has now been translated into 10 languages for release in 40 countries. And we are also lucky this afternoon to have Rachel Statham. Rachel is a Scottish public policy expert and is an economic commentator. She currently works for IPPR Scotland and has originally joining as an economic analyst and is now a senior research fellow. She leads work on social security and inclusive growth, as well as being a board member of the Scottish Women's Budget Group, and she's a regular commentator in the Scottish media, including appearing in the new Darren McGarvey documentary, Investigating Class in Scotland. So we're in for an exciting afternoon. And when I read the book, the thing that really dawned on me, and I asked Linda if it was all right to say this, is this book does for me what Caroline Corrado Perez and Invisible Women did for data. It brings together so much research from so many sources and systematically debunks myth after myth relating to the economy. Now, Linda, for anyone who hasn't read the book, can you tell us about the double X economy, please?
Sure. The double X economy as a concept and a term refers to the global women's economy in which a long-standing and consistent set of constraints across the whole world acts to produce a pattern of economic inequality among females that differs actually very little from place to place. These constraints and the inequalities they produce reach well beyond employment to entrepreneurship, control over capital, participation in markets. So it's really big. I sometimes say that this pattern is big enough and stark enough that you could see it from space. The Double X Economy as a book is intended to recruit people to the cause of women's economic empowerment. And it does so by showing the reach, the impact, and the history of these constraints, and concentrating on the way it affects phenomena from GDP to war and hunger and trafficking. Basically, this is a recruitment document. So I do a good bit of debunking, as Susan said, of myths. What I did essentially was to take every excuse I had ever heard of, most of which you will have heard of, for gender inequality, and looked into the science. And what I one at a time found that the science simply does not support any of those contentions. And so, and I would like to sort of endorse my credibility a little bit on this by repeating that I've gotten a good bit of recognition from the scientific community. So I think I did a pretty good job on the science. Basically, it comes down to male dominance is just, none of those myths are good science.
Thank you. So one of the areas in the book that particularly interested me, and I think particularly relevant for a Scottish audience, is the data around productivity. And there's been so much work in Scotland talking about Scotland's productivity puzzle or the innovation conundrum, but there's not as much focus on the relationship of productivity and gender equality. And can you tell us why that's so important?
Yes, I think we have a tendency to assume that the effect of women on the economy is trivial because of the history of women being excluded from it. In fact, at this point in time, that is definitely not the case, and a lot of the data in the book aims to illustrate that. Productivity itself, of course, is a set of interrelated influences. So I'll just give you a couple of examples how the gender inequality affects it. So for example, national competitiveness is an input to productivity, and it is essentially a measure of efficient use of resources. The data shows quite convincingly that it is directly related to women's economic empowerment, and I show some graphs about that in the book. Why does this happen? Well, in essence, as I said, these are measures are a function of using resources efficiently. So for instance, if women are more educated in a country than the men are, which is now true in virtually every developed nation, but they're not brought into not only the workforce, but positions of management, innovativeness, creativity, then what's happening is that nation is losing its investment in their education, and it becomes a waste of that investment, and which in turn has follow-on effects for these other measures. If women-owned businesses are performing equally to men-owned businesses until they run into the need for capital in order to grow, and again, this happens in every country for which I have seen the data, then that is going to have a negative impact on growth, but also, for example, on innovativeness and productivity. An interesting thing to consider is the impact on households. If women are having to work part-time, or if they're working for unequal pay, then the household that they're in will have a harder time meeting their day-to-day needs, and less money will go into savings than into consumption. The double X economy also produces costs that drag on national economies, such as violence and crime. It's just as well as conflict and instability and autocracy and things like that. So it's important to appreciate the magnitude of these effects. As it is right now, working women in North America and Europe contribute 37 to 40% of GDP. So it's a big deal. They're more than half the labor force in the United States, and worldwide they produce more than half of the world's food supply. So it's time for us to start looking at them as key players and not bit players.
I mean, I have to say, when I started reading the book, I hadn't expected to read so much about the intricate relation with violence, and I was really my new favorite animal, I've got to tell you, Linda, is bonobos. And I really want you to tell the story of what's the relationship between rational economic van and you mentioned violence and waste there, and bonobos, and why do people need to think differently about perhaps the economic story they've been told throughout their lives?
Right. Yes. So this was one of bonobos is what came out of my investigation into whether male dominance was natural, and I also fell in love with them. So I'm glad to be asked the question. Bonobos' very existence proves that male dominance is not encoded in human genetics. It is not natural, and I argue in the book it's detrimental to our survival rather than guaranteeing it. Bonobos, as you know, are a lot like chimps. So they look a lot like chimps. So people thought until very recently that they were chimps. And it's only been in the last 8 years that their genetics were sequenced. And it was found that they share 99% of their genetic material with chimps. 99.6% of their genetic material with chimps, and 99% of it with humans. So they are actually genetically identical to chimps. And this is very important because the social structure and behaviors of chimps versus bonobos are complete opposites. Among chimpanzees, it's male dominant. Chimps are male dominant. They're very patriarchal. They're violent. They're warlike. Bonobos, on the other hand, are female dominant. they're peaceful, and their whole social structure is based on sharing. Now, we don't know at this point, and probably will never know, what the common ancestor that humans and chimps and bonobos have was like. We don't know anything about that creature. But we can say at this point that there's a 50-50 chance that humans are naturally male dominant and 50-50% chances they were female dominant. Now, how can we say that? There seems to be a good argument and some evidence to be made that actually both chimps and humans, and I outlined this in the book, came to be male dominant because of a cycle of violence and domination that emerged among them. And that, in fact, creating a more gender equal society would make and does make that whole cycle of violence reduce and finally go away. So that's how humans fit into this. It gives us hope to think that some of the worst things about humans are not hardwired and we can change them.
And so rational economic man is something you unpick a bit in the book. And it's particularly when you look at all the examples from around the world, you kind of end up thinking it's an irrational economic man. And actually, if we invested a bit more in women's economic empowerment, we might have a rational economic person. Would that be fair to say?
Yes, it would be fair to say. If you'd like for me to elaborate on that a little bit, I have my doubts whether the model of rational economic man fits any human behavior, to be perfectly honest. I think that both men and women have a different way of acting economically in the world, that while it may have its reasons, perfectly rational reasons in the context, I think it's rare that you see anyone in the grocery store, for example, with a little calculator trying to figure out which brand of peas to buy. I think it's a very big exaggeration. In terms of males, particularly, I find it kind of amusing that they became the model of rationality. These are the most violent people in the world. They brought you war and all kinds of suffering, and their purchase habits tend to be not pro-social like medicine and food, but antisocial like guns and tobacco and alcohol. So the idea that they set the standard for economic rationality is, I think, pretty dubious.
Thanks, Linda. I'm just going to bring Rachel in here. And Rachel, you've kind of broken through as one of the new female commentators on the economy in Scotland, and you're kind of a fresh face now, I think, on television, if I can say that without sounding patronising, and I don't mean to be at all. But you're involved in the Scottish Women's Budget Group, and you've been immersed in all the development of the new social security system in Scotland. You know, are we making any progress in Scotland, or are we just the same as the rest of the world? What are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer is that yes, we are making progress, and Scotland is kind of striking out on quite a distinct path, particularly compared to other parts of the UK. You know, the UK government at Westminster is the obvious kind of comparator. And we see this particularly through the inclusive growth agenda, which is kind of ambitions to not just aim for kind of quantity of growth, but to look at the quality of growth across Scotland, how that growth is distributed, who benefits from it. And if we look at what that means in terms of kind of local level economic development across the country, we're seeing more emphasis on women's exclusion, at the kind of local level, and what mechanisms, can begin to kind of correct that, to enable women's full participation. And that has kind of by design shifted our focus to kind of look more broadly at what our economy in Scotland is designed for. What outputs we want from it, whether that's just kind of GDP growth endlessly, or whether it's something with a kind of greater common value. We've got things like the National Performance Framework now that's expanded what our kind of ambitions, what indicators we're looking to shift through kind of economic progress across the country. And now we've got kind of ambitions looking towards a well-being economy that are perhaps fairly kind of fuzzily defined at the moment. And obviously a lot's up for grabs in an election year. But we have some really encouraging ambition. And I think now it's the stage where, particularly dealing with a crisis of the magnitude we're dealing with at the moment, it's about kind of making sure we've got the tangible action to take those ambitions forward and really begin to shift outcomes for women, and for kind of Scotland's economy as a whole.
And Linda touches on that'll be the postman, Linda. Linda touched on the fragility of progress in the book. And do you think the progress we've got in Scotland, Rachel, is here to stay, or do you think it might be fragile and might need more people to come in behind it to say this is the right way to go?
Yeah. I think it's certainly fragile. I think Linda's book does a really excellent job of demonstrating how, across a really wide range of different economies, progress when it comes to women's economic participation, economic empowerment, really can't be taken for granted. If we look at the UK, or the Scottish context, it's just been, about 50 years really that we've seen women entering the labour market on a similar footing to men. We know there's still, a huge amount of distance still to travel. And it's really important that we're not complacent now. And I think the kind of current economic conditions we're living through have really laid that bare. We've seen the care work, the unpaid work that women disproportionately shoulder made more visible than ever before. We've seen exactly what happens when care services, whether that's childcare, schools, or social care services, are withdrawn. And how much that work that we kind of otherwise take for granted, that kind of invisible social infrastructure that the rest of our economy relies on, just how big and how important that is to all our lives. But I think it's incredibly important that we don't kind of squander this moment and that visibility by not making the changes that we really need to kind of hardwire our economy for gender justice.
Mm-hmm. I think COVID has a disproportionate effect on women's and participation in the workforce, definitely. But the stats on who has been disproportionately affected by the economic circumstances are really, really stark. I'm really struck by how we might level the playing field. What do you think is next for Scotland?
Yeah, a good question. Well, I think if we look at the crisis response we've got now, even if we look at the kind of top level, which industries are being prioritised, where are we having conversations about reopening or about increased business support, and who works in those industries, we see things like kind of hairdressing, or the kind of the really large beauty industry across the UK, or even the fashion industry kind of being left behind. Or kind of in the case of fashion, kind of struck by new complications around trade arrangements. And it's really important that we don't kind of deprioritize sectors that are seen as less glamorous, perhaps less kind of high tech, kind of high productivity as they've been historically, and that we look across the piece and really think about as we're designing an economic recovery, who's going to benefit from it. As we're looking at jobs are inevitably going to be shed. We're seeing that already through rising unemployment. As we're looking at which jobs are created, questions about who has access to those jobs and what routes into those good new jobs look like, and whether those are routes that are accessible to women and particularly to mothers in the workforce is going to be incredibly important. And a huge amount of work and thinking to be done there. And I think Linda's book gives us some excellent starting points.
And do you think we've had, you mentioned the differences between the UK and Scotland. I was really struck by the different approaches, and particularly related to trust. In Scotland, the additional money for school meals and holidays went directly to families, and the UK government made a very different approach and definitely took the approach to trust big business rather than the children's parents or carers, and didn't necessarily lead to a good result when you saw the pictures of the meals that were being provided. That feels like a really stark contrast to me about trust and power and all those sorts of things. And I did wonder, is it related to the fact that we've got more women at Holyrood, and we also know that we've got more women about to stand down from Holyrood, and particularly some of the younger female MSPs? Do you think that's a threat to more economic empowerment for women going forward?
Yes, I think we have seen a different approach, particularly to social security, through the development of Scotland's new social security agency, kind of principles of dignity and a human rights approach that underpinned that so far. And that's been very welcome progress, and we've seen it exactly through through this crisis and what deliveries looked like. Although obviously a lot of progress still to be made, still incredibly difficult times that a lot of families across the country are living through. When it comes to the question of who's making those decisions, we have some really encouraging progress. We have a relatively young, in kind of politician terms, female finance cabinet secretary in Scotland. Obviously we have Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister. We do have women making decisions about major public spending priorities. in a way that we haven't seen in Scotland over in the last 20 years of devolution. But I think this kind of electoral round has shown us just how fragile that progress is. We saw women move into the new parliament at the kind of dawn of devolution 20 years ago, on an almost equal footing to men, and now we see that actually, that progress is really quite fragile. And if we want to see, equality of representation to kind of begin to make progress on agendas that are perhaps haven't been taken as seriously when they've been considered as kind of women's economic questions, things like childcare, we know are vitally important to how our economy as a whole functions. It's going to be really important that we have a really robust conversation about women's role in public life, and particularly the forces that mean that that women, particularly kind of talented cabinet secretaries we've seen in Scotland, are making the decision not to continue on at Parliament. And obviously those will be individual decisions a lot of the time, but we need to be looking at what kind of political culture we have created in this in this country and across the UK, and what barriers still stand to women's full participation.
Lucy, can I ask you to change the setup so that you can pin us all on screen at the same time? And what we'll do is begin to move into the bit where I bring in audience questions. So if you want to ask your questions in the Q&A, we'll come to you very soon. I have a few more questions. There were so many bits in the book. I was really struck, Linda, when you were talking about the history of women's participation in the workforce, and talking about the problems people had when they first became labelled as factory girls, or the knock-on impacts. But the fact that those trends had been similar in different countries all around the world, they were things that I just hadn't thought about before. You knew what had happened in your own country, or maybe a couple of others, but actually that a similar trend had taken place in so many countries really shocked me.
Yeah, actually, and this phenomenon of the similarity from country to country is something that surprises people a lot, and we have just an enormous amount of data of various sorts showing that now. We've all been taught, I think, to think of a difference between gender and sex, right? We were all taught that in school. One is cultural, one is biological. The scientific attitude toward this at this point is that it's really not something you can divorce. But if it is in fact cultural, and should vary a lot from place to place, then there should be actually societies in which gender is equal. And we don't find either of those things. We find it very consistent. In terms of women coming into the labor force, yes, there is a remarkable consistency, for example, in the history, the trends, and the timing between North America and Western Europe after the 1970s, as a result of the 1970s. And there's excellent reason to believe, in fact, I think it's pretty much conclusive at this point, that one of the reasons those countries got as rich as they did during that period was the entry of the women into the labor force. It's also something that follows, that education follows rather than education predicting. So it rolls into a lot of difference in investment. Right now, what we're seeing is the countries in Latin America having the same pattern with the same effects, for instance, but it's happening much, much faster. It took the West about 100 years to make this transition, and Latin America is going to make it in half that probably. And so for that reason, the data shows that country prosperity does correspond. It's been proven with data from 163 countries does correspond with female labor force participation. So there's a lot of economic development policy now that's focused on that.
Mm-hmm. I'm just sending a text message to someone because I noticed we've got someone in the audience who might have something to say. So I'll let Rachel and Linda just talk about that a little bit while I just send them a message, say, do you want to come on screen and talk to us?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, Linda, one thing that I think the book does really excellently is kind of trace the lines between particularly men's violence against women and women's economic participation. And I think, me as a reader, kind of reading particularly from a Scottish context, where we know, violence against women is obviously still, at crisis levels, particularly at the moment. I wondered if you could just expand on those links and kind of how profound you think they are.
Sorry, could you repeat that last part?
Sorry, I just wondered if you could expand on those links and kind of how pervasive you think they are, in a kind of range of different economic contexts.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm having really trouble hearing you for some reason.
Can others hear me, or is it?
Can links between?
Sorry, between men's violence against women and women's economic.
Right. Okay, so there's definitely a link in domestic violence, right? That the World Health Organization established with their first cross-cultural study, that the three inputs into that are whether a community tolerates the violence, whether children see the violence, and the size of the economic gap between men and women. So I think the data indicate it has to do with the degree of dependency that women have on men. And when they're utterly dependent on men, it puts them in a position of vulnerability that makes it possible and likely that the men will engage in violence. There is also a lot of violence that arises when women go to work with excuses made that they're not in their place and need to be put back in their place. So there's a lot of, I often say that interventions on behalf of women have to be done almost surgically in order to avoid increasing the violence. At the same time, it's important, we see this definitely in the work in developing world, is that the thing that keeps women, actually in the developed world as well, that keeps women in domestic environments is lack of money. And so it allows them, and when they have some money, that's like the first thing they do, they take their children and they get out. So that's real important. The other thing is, Susan mentioned factory girls. It's really interesting because we tend to look at the labor abuses that happen in factories for girls, and we ignore what their alternative is, which is to stay in villages that dictate basically their lives and open them up to just as much, if not more, violence. So it becomes really important that by going into the cities and working for factories, the young girls who do this have the chance to break that cycle. And that's why they do it. And so what we see is a follow-on effect between, or an iterative effect really, between women's economic empowerment and the reduction of other forms of gender inequality, including violence.
Great. So we've got our first question we're going to take from Rebecca Kent. So if Rebecca, you can get ready to come off mute. And the second question, I'm really pleased to say, is the person I was asking if they would speak, which is Susan Deakin, who might have something to say about the political things we were talking about earlier. So Rebecca, would you ask your question, please?
Hi all, thank you. This is a really interesting discussion. I'm interested in which country or countries you think perform the best in terms of gender equality, or have made the most progress at least, and what you think are the key policies that underpin this.
Yeah. So I think that are you asking me? I assume that's for me. Okay. It's actually a difficult thing to say. In the global rankings, what you see consistently is that the Scandinavian countries rank at the top, and it kind of stair steps down to countries that are impoverished and enmeshed in violence. And that would be what you'd predict from what I've just said, right? The problem is that the measures that we use to compile those rankings were originally poverty fighting, employed for economic development in terms of fighting poverty. And so as a result, they are intrinsically set up to advantage developed economies. And so on a lot of the measures, what you see is already a ceiling effect on those. And so what we need are different measures really to pick up. There are some things that are not going right in Scandinavia, for instance, but the measures we use don't pick that up. So it's hard to say. Policies, there are definitely policies that help, but for example, in the Western countries, although they are most developed in this way, they took a really long time to get there because they resisted it and they did not enact policies to encourage it. So what we see now is that in some developing countries where the women are in the macro measurements way far behind than, for example, Scandinavia, we're seeing some policies being enacted that might speed that up. So any kind of support for working women is a very good thing to invest. There's a lot of investment in women's entrepreneurship, which is really important to support married women who are usually the bulk of adult women. So things like that. I hope that answers.
Thanks, Linda. Susan, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Hi, yeah, you hearing me?
Yep, we can hear you well, Susan. Thank you.
Yeah, you took me by surprise there when you called me out. So,
Sorry, I saw you lurking, and I thought, oh, I can't miss the opportunity to see what you think about this.
well, yeah, thanks for asking me, and it's great to listen to the discussion. I think the fact that we are much more alive to the question of well, women's involvement in policy making and their impact, and I think you mentioned political culture in particular being an area of interest of mine that is really important. And I suppose, I don't know who all's on the call, but I mean, I should just say I spent the first 8 years as a member of the Scottish Parliament and in the Scottish Government. And I suppose I just have a concern that while I think we've made great strides, I think one, it's really important that we don't always get preoccupied by numbers, as I think we often tend to do around the whole question of gender balance for very obvious reasons, but I think we have to drill deeper than that. And secondly, I do worry that we sometimes believe our own rhetoric a bit too much. I don't think that the political culture has changed nearly enough or anything like we hoped that it would when the Scottish Parliament was created more than 20 years ago. And I think we have got very good in Scotland of kind of rehearsing a narrative that we start to believe ourselves. And I think we need to test it more and allow others to test us more. So those would be my thoughts. I don't think there's a question in there, but I'd be very interested to hear either of the speakers or anyone else on the call just share their thoughts on that subject.
Thanks, Susan. I'm really shocked at the number of women standing down, but also when you look at the data, I know you mentioned data, but when you look at the data on the different kinds of threats that women in public life face, and it seems much more common now, probably even than when you were in Parliament, that as soon as a woman speaks and says something that people might disagree with, she seems to be receiving death threats or threats of other types of violence, and that just blows my mind that anyone would want to go into a public role, given that you might have a family and you might be experiencing that. I don't know if Rachel or Linda have any reflections on that from other situations.
I'm sorry, in terms of women's representation and willingness to engage. Yeah. I think it's very important in the long run for us to support this. Certainly in the US, for example, in the 2018 election, we saw the influx of women leaders into the Congress having an immediate effect on legislation under consideration. The research, however, does have some indication that this is something that has to be in the system for a generation. So this is one of the reasons why seeing younger women standing down should be alarming, because they probably are the generation that would be bringing in the big difference. So it's very concerning. I will say this, that there isn't necessarily a direct connection in the data between women's representation in government and women's freedoms in the economy. I'm not sure exactly why that is. I think it might have to do with kind of the politics of women in some countries that win office and how they got to office. I mean, in my country, there are lots of very conservative Republican women, and their being in power is not necessarily good for the rest of us. I think it's also important, at least it is to me, is to be recognizing the very important sea change that has occurred in the Western nations over the last 50 years in terms of men's attitudes toward gender equality. The data show that the men in those countries overwhelmingly are in favor of gender equality. And it's also important to remember that over the last 100 years, when reforms were made to women's rights, they had to be made by men because all of the governments, all of the judiciary were held by men. So that meant then that somewhere along the line, somebody was sympathetic and somebody was persuasive. And that's true even now. So I think it is equally important to be paying attention to the sympathies of the men.
Mm-hmm. So next up, we've got a question from Chris Carr, taking us on a slightly more international viewpoint. Chris, can you unmute and ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, Chris.
Right. Okay. I was just citing a very extreme example, Linda, and in 2019 on the Ethiopia's Hawassa's retail park, which serves many retail fashion chains, was paying $26 a week, quite deliberately lower by the government for the minimum wage compared with China, which was $326 a week. Most of these were young women walking sometimes 6 hours a day to get to work, living in wretched conditions and often going hungry. So I just wonder what sort of data you have on these sort of extremes around the world, and also thoughts on what pressure it puts on other suppliers. Leicester recently has been highlighted and criticized because in the same sector, criminal activities resulted in people being paid well below the minimum wage in Britain.
Right. The kind of data that I'm working with most of the time doesn't break out as finely as the examples that you've given. There are, however, a number of the way that women's economic empowerment, whether you're working with USAID or the World Bank or whoever, the way they figure out what works or what doesn't is to do randomized controlled trials where they can have a program and see whether it works or not, what level of support it requires or not. And so I would think that on some of those, it would be, for example, you were talking about the support for the Ethiopian women. There are lots of programs that focus on what can be done to help women in the kind of circumstances that you're talking about. I will say this, that it's very important in those circumstances, as well as in reforms that are to be broadly enacted, to have a better sense of fairness than certainly is common in the UK. That the feeling that anything you do on behalf of women is intrinsically unfair to men. And this certainly applies, especially in world trade, for example, so in supply chains that for example, the International Trade Center says 99% of international trade is controlled by men. So if you then say any intervention on the part of women is unfair, I think that's pretty ridiculous, because if 99% of trade is controlled by men, that is fundamentally what we would consider elsewhere in the economy a monopoly. And I think it's utterly fair for there to be interventions to make that an even or more even playing field. But we have to get over that idea that anything we do for women is intrinsically unfair. And I will add that doctrine, which is encoded into law in the United Kingdom, is not common elsewhere in the world.
Okay, the questions are coming in thick and fast now, so I'll ask people to unmute quickly, ask a question succinctly, and we'll try and get in as many as we can. Gillian, could you come off mute and ask your question, please?
Yeah, hi. So I'm interested in the fact that sectors, occupations which are traditionally women dominated tend to be valued lower, and whether you're aware of any kind of successful approaches to increasing the value of sectors or jobs more broadly.
Is that for me?
I think, or okay. Both of you, if Rachel's got any examples.
So let's see if Rachel does first, because I'd like to defer to her if she does.
Yeah, I don't think I've got an example of it being fixed. I think we definitely know from the literature that actually women moving into sectors becoming, feminized, dominated by women workers, actually decreases the value associated with those sectors. So we know that this is, part of a kind of that kind of more intrinsic challenge of what we value in our economy, what kinds of work we value. We see obviously with things like the care sector in Scotland at the moment, where wages are chronically low, and yet we have a kind of cultural conversation about how vital kind of care is, particularly over the last year that we've had, and yet that that economic value attached to that work doesn't actually change, and so it's definitely kind of the toughest nut to crack, but that's not to say there isn't progress that can be made. through our work at IPPR, we've looked at things like kind of sectoral wage boards, kind of social partnership approaches to increasing pay in chronically low-paid sectors. There's also things you could do looking at that kind of productivity challenge we opened with, looking at how you can raise pay and productivity in hand in low-wage sectors, rather than thinking that the only kind of way, the only sectors that are worth trying to boost productivity in are those that are kind of already high paid, already more likely to be dominated by men, and already kind of creating kind of good and stable jobs, rather than those that employ more people, are more likely to employ women, and are more likely to be kind of defined by by insecure work and low wages at the moment. So I say that's one of the kind of central challenges that we have to be grappling with, and that this crisis, for all the hardship it's creating, is at least creating space to think about what work we value, and kind of what the future direction for Scotland's economy can look like, and that's the kind of challenge we should be grappling with.
So do you want me to, shall I jump in here?
Yeah.
In terms of the question of industries growing and creating jobs, there's definitely industry clustering by gender. And one of the reasons this happens is that there's bias in the investment system that allocates considerably more capital to men than to women, and therefore those industries grow more. And it has a cyclical effect, because the bankers, for instance, will say, well, growth of the industry is a criterion by which we decide where to invest our money. But because they don't invest their money in certain other industries that don't meet their criteria, those industries don't grow. So it's not just that they don't invest in industries that are not growing, but that because they don't invest, those industries don't grow. So there's a need to kind of look more closely at that, and in particular to look at the criteria that investors use, particularly the banks, that they think are objective, but in fact, they're fundamentally not. They're fundamentally biased. Now, I think the other thing is this business we talked about earlier about raising the awareness of the size of the impact that gender equality has on economics. So for instance, there's in many economies, but especially in the developed economies, there's a big emphasis in the government on investing in technology. Okay, and not so much in investing in women. Okay, and yet the magnitude of what you can achieve by investing in women, I would argue, is probably bigger. If you look at the tech sector as such, and not just our consumption of technological devices, it's important that there's big growth among digital companies or technological companies, but there's also an extremely high rate of failure. So I think on balance, it's probably just as big a thing to invest in women, and probably a more reliable investment. So it has a lot to do with our preconceptions about what good investments are.
One of the things we've not touched on yet is the strength of organizations where there is diversity of thought, and how that improves performance overall. And I think that's probably worth us bringing in here. It's not just one sex over another. It's actually when we have more diversity of thought, the organizations end up much stronger. And I think that comes through.
Right.
Yeah, well, both.
Yeah. So this is an interesting thing, because there is really quite a large body of literature that has demonstrated the positive effect of diversity on all kinds of business outcomes. And you can also see that there are clusters, industrial clusters, where there's more gender equality, and that those companies, even in the stock market, perform better. Okay, so there are people out there who will take one or two of these studies and quibble with the methodology, and they're obviously people who are not friendly to gender equality, so you got to kind of question their motives. But you have to look at the convergence of all the data, and this is true on a number of the gender equality issues at this point. You have to remember that there are very large bodies of data and numbers of studies, and attacking any one of them cannot contradict the overall direction of what the literature shows. And definitely the literature shows more transparency, accountability, more creativity, better products, more growth, less instability, all kinds of things for companies and for economies if you have diverse teams. And it makes sense, right? I mean, when I do research, I try to include men in my research because they notice things and do things that I'm not going to notice and do, right? And it helps me to have a more 360-degree view.
Yeah, I'm going to whiz through some questions here. Laurence has got a question about the impact of role models. And have you done any assessment of that? I mean, I suppose in a way it could be companies as well as individuals leading the way.
There are a lot of studies that come up with role models as an answer. I kind of think it's gotten to be a pat answer. It's the answer people get on their top of mind, right? And so they come up with that. I am not convinced that necessarily women need women as role models. That I think that most successful women in the world today have had one male role model. And I think that that it undercuts them, underestimates them a little bit to think that. I think it's also that we need to understand a bit more on the limits for the role models that there are. So that, for example, in one study I did, the women in that sector had had a very hard time reaching the posts that they'd reached. They did not feel like they had beat the system. They did not feel they had won. What they felt is that they survived. They were a bit bitter about the mistreatment they'd had. They also had to work very hard just to keep it up. So they didn't have the time or the heart to give to the younger women. They were really kind of sad creatures in this sector. And in addition, the young women did not necessarily want to take modeling and advice from those older women because they thought they were overly bitter or something like that. So it's not an easy thing to fix just by having more women at the top.
Rachel, did it make a difference to you? You know, you're one of the younger voices coming through on the economy. Did it make a difference that you weren't seeing faces like you, or did it make that you more determined to specialize in economics?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things you see really clearly as a woman in economics broadly is just how questions are taken seriously or less seriously compared, what's kind of seen as hard economic science and what's kind of seen as complexity that could probably be explained away somehow. I think Linda's book does a really excellent job of kind of dealing with that, and it's myth busting on the gender pay gap, for instance. You know, you can kind of throw a lot of variables into your model and say, well, we've explained away the gender pay gap. It doesn't exist, because we've created, a kind of hypothetical world in which these structural barriers that women face, are kind of rendered invisible. I think there's a huge amount of work still to be done, and my concern often is that we don't just have a kind of token woman economist, when what we really need is a huge diversity of thought, to kind of reshape economics as discipline, to reshape kind of what we're trying to do with it, and that diversity has to be within women as well. It can't just be white middle class women like myself, shaping that conversation. And it needs to be a kind of across all levels. So from kind of analysts, to kind of policy, the kind of policy side, to the kind of public side, and the kind of political culture that we're creating, as we've already touched on. And there's really considerable distance to go as far as that's concerned.
Yeah, I think.
Can I jump here?
Yeah.
Yeah, about economics in particular. I think that I would like to sort of amend what I was saying earlier in terms of not so much role models, but it's important to understand that to a large degree, gender equality in any one setting is a numbers game. That we see that the more women there are in an organization or in a discipline or in a sector, the more likely, in fact, over time, you will see that culture of gender inequality soften. And one of the biggest examples, as far as my opinion, and I talk about this a lot in the book, is economics, which is the most male-dominated discipline in the world. They have an outsized impact on the outside world because of their role that they play with governments. They bully, intimidate young women, and that's why, not because women are stupid and can't do math, that's why they don't have any women They don't seem to be bothered by it because they think women are unproductive and stupid. But what it also means is that they have refused to look at women in the economy, and therefore they are ignoring the double X economy, or ignoring half the economy. And so it affects how they think. So the more young women we can get into economics, not so much because they'll eventually become role models, but because it's a numbers game, the better.
Mm-hmm. I think, I mean, that's what your book brought home to me, is the firm positioning in the past, definitely as economics as closer to maths. And actually, when you look at the vast realms of data that you present and myth busting along the way, it's just so very clearly a social science. And I think reclaiming economics as a social science rather than as a definitive thing that can't be argued with is really important. And I think you've both teed up. Our next event is actually with Aaron Ardvani, who has done the numbers crunching of what economics looks like in the UK and the lack of diversity of voices in it. But also how it differs from all the other social sciences. And that numbers game is coming through really strongly. So anyone interested in this question in particular, I can definitely recommend our next event. Yeah. We are rapidly running out of time. We've got questions that group together, I think, under what's going to make it different for the next generation. I wondered if both of you want to reflect on that, and then I'll hand over to Ken at the end. But yeah, do think about, we've got questions that are related to families and parenthood and education and schooling have come through, but I think it's probably better to take them as a group, and both of you reflect on those together, and then I hand over to Ken, otherwise we will never wrap up in time. So I don't know who wants to go first.
I can go first. Linda to close us off. So I think, you know, what's going to change things is asking different questions. And I think that, you know, that last question leads us really neatly into that. You know, when we're talking about the economy, what we're actually talking about, which bits are visible, you know, what's seen as, you know, the really pertinent and pressing needs to direct our collective resources towards. You know, what's our conception of fairness? You know, who does it include? You know, when we're talking about you know, jobs growth, you know, the recovery from this crisis. You know, whose lives are we talking about? You know, who are we kind of aiming to, you know, to kind of benefit? You know, who are the winners and losers? I think you know, that is about a kind of a transformation in our public policy conversation, as well as, you know, as economics and discipline as a discipline, you know, and as well as you know, in kind of our, you know, ambitions as a society. So it's you know, a quite profound challenge, but a really exciting one. You know, and we're at a moment now when, you know, when really the kind of path we take will define, you know, what the next 100 years looks like, what the next, you know, what women's lives for the next 100 years look like. And yeah, there's a huge amount of potential there.
Fantastic. Linda?
I think right now that women's situation economically and in terms of broader rights is kind of like teetering on the top of a mountain right now. And I think the worst case scenario is that we go down because of right-wing influences that are misogynistic, that are intentionally and actually focused on taking women down. If those people are scary to me on behalf of women. And I think that could be a bad future. I often bring up the example of The Handmaid's Tale, if anybody has seen that. What enabled that scenario to occur is the very first thing they do is they take away women's right to work and hold money. And after that, they have no power, and all the rest of it teeters from there. So we really need to be paying attention to that. On the other hand, I do think the weight of all factors says it's going to go the other way. And that's because I think that we have more consciousness of it now. The international data to which I refer to in this book just shows just overwhelmingly that we would benefit from doing it. There's just no question about it. The women's movement has, particularly economically, has more institutional support than it has ever had in history. So I think the sense of women as a total group, the fact that we're all connected all around the world would argue for this coming out for the best. And so I would just say, if you wanted to come out the best way, you need to pitch up and support other women in the economy.
Fantastic, Linda. Thank you very much. And just before I hand over to Ken, I will give you one last look at the book. I definitely recommend reading it and recommending it to a friend. It is not just a book for women. It is a really important economic, I think, historical tour of across the world. Really worth a good read, and definitely one that anyone interested in the subject should read. So Ken, I will hand over to you now to give a vote of thanks and sum up.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks, Ken.
I don't think we can do video. Oh, here we go. Start my video. Well, thank you to all the participants today, and not least to you, Susan, for your chairing. I'd like to first of all thank Professor Linda Scott for taking the time to speak to us today from Providence, Rhode Island. Scotland benefits enormously from having some of the finest thinkers in their field take the time to speak to us virtually, and Linda's undoubtedly one of those. It's been a fascinating insight, chastening as it should be, but I love the positive message at the end. Thanks to Rachel for her insights, which were fascinating, and for giving her distinctively Scottish perspective on things. What did I take away from it? Well, I've recently retired from the investment management community. The investment management world controls capital, and the frightening news there is that only 7% of mutual funds are managed by women. And that means that men command more than $10 trillion of capital in excess of that of women. And it's not been getting better. That trend has been pretty stable for a long time. And I think the reason for that is quite clear. It's been an aggressive male chimpanzee world, which was difficult for women to work in. And the criteria used for perceived ability were very male. They would often mistake aggression for being confident in opinion. And the price that we've paid for that, and I think this is something that Linda shines a light on, is not just quantitative. It's not just the way, it's not the amount of money that's managed, it's also the way that money is put to work. I saw short-termism, I saw lack of stewardship in companies, I saw narrowness of vision. And while it's difficult for me with my perspective to know whether that's because it was a male-dominated world, I'm pretty sure that that was one of the reasons. But you know, as Linda highlighted at the end, the way out of this is first of all to raise knowledge of it, an understanding of it through her work, her book, and so on. And then for those who understand the problem, to go out there and do something about it. I'm pretty sure that many of you in the audience today meet those criteria. So let's get out there and fix it. So thank you all for attending today. Our next event is on the 23rd. It's the one with Dr. Aaron Advani that Susan has told us about. I think it looks fascinating, so I hope many of you can join us there. We can only do this with your support. We are entirely funded by donations, and you can find out how to do that on our website. And there you will also, in the next day or two, find a recording of this. And please pass what I think has been a fascinating discussion. Please pass it on to those who may not have made it today. With that, I thank you all for your attendance and look forward to hearing from you again.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone.